Alright, I'm going to continue reading The Devil in Massachusetts, Chapter 20, The Devil in Cotton Mather. What had actually been accomplished on the spiritual plane by the wholesale jail delivery of 1693 was a point which, at the time, could only be described as a mote. In spite of the relief which many communities felt at the lifting of the nightmare, the eagerness with which husbands welcomed back their witches, repenting that they had ever distrusted them, people further removed from the scene could look on the whole process of a monstrous miscarriage of justice, uh, boding no good to fortune of Massachusetts. I don't know why that's becoming a problem for me to say. These agreed with Sultan. They were in a way to have cleared the land of the witches. Who it is that obstructs the course of justice, I know not. It was true that some of the most obvious symptoms of witchcraft were disappearing. Little was heard from the afflicted girls once the jail delivery got underway, though logically the return of so many witches to civilian life should have afflicted them even unto death. None of the girls did die. They remained well enough. A few notably Mary Walcott and Elizabeth both presently settled down and got married. Some of the others still manless and apparently at a loss how to put in their time in these duller, flatter days turned. It was remourned uh, to 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 kosher uh, of pleasures. Certain of them, never explicitly named in history, went unmistakably bad. In Salem Village, where this development could be watched at close range, there was said to be a general revulsion against them. It was not good to watch a wench uh, at her harlotries, and remember that on that harlot's word, the good and chaste had been hanged. But at further removed, other interpretations were possible. The girls were being slandered, and the judges with them would, the likes of William Stoughton, have been taken in by harlots. Also, it was by no means certain that the girls had come out of their fits. It was more probable that these were being uh, casually ignored when they fell into them. Look what had happened in the fall of 1692 when the girls had tried in vain to warn its witch of a malefactor. God was punishing an unworthy, half hearted people by so hardening their hearts that they were incapable of receiving further uh, revelation. The plain truth was for those who had eyes to see the devil was by no means bound up, not had not lost his battle against New England, but as well on his way to bringing the entire community under his power. Of this there were unmistakable signs. What was the devil? To the Puritan, the question was no less important than the question, what is God? A surprising variety of answers were possible. Some in Massachusetts were still reading an English bestseller 2 decades old, John Milton's Paradise Lost, in which the poet in defeat and blindness had all unconsciously created Satan in his own image, doomed but not without his grandeur. Such a being could be abhorred, but not despised, and one might pity even respect an enemy of humankind. In his contest with omnipotence, he showed a perverse nobility of spirit. There was something most uh, Promethean in the tragic Satan who fell, who from hell defied the lightning of heaven and reached out to make mankind his own. Yet, how far was such a concept understood in uh, pro, provincial Massachusetts, whose own tastes were represented by the organ music of Milton's Black Verse, but by the jigging and, and jingling of uh, Wigglesworth Day of Doom. Certainly, I'm trying desperately to turn this page. There we go. Cotton Mather, who had his own copy of Paradise Lost, did not associate Satan with the grandeur of loss, but not ignorable causes. His Satan had more the spirit of the poltergeist or of the comic devil of the early miracle plays. The fellow was ubiquitous and as such damnably dangerous and internally a nuisance, but as little dignified as a worm that eats up the garden. Still, a third concept was possible. The stage adversary who presented himself before God in the time of Job and was received uh, with courteous attention. What manner of devil was this who did not stop to laying pity and petty ambush of his enemy, but came openly into God's presence and challenged him? And what meaning could be read into God's acceptance of a challenge from such a source? Could it be that such was the omnipotence of God that the very devil worked from him to examine the hearts of men to test the limits of their faith? Was it possible that God made use of the devil to bring a new thing on earth, that out of ill good would come? Yet the good would come out of what the devil had done in Massachusetts. The phase of the colony's martyrdom had been not single but multiple. Not the witchcraft, but only the new character had delivered the faithful into the devil's hands. Now the people outside the faith could vote and shape the course of government. The power of theocracy had been forever broken. No longer would it be possible to get rid of previously creative minds, the Anne Hutchinson and Roger uh, Williamses, by exile and death. Demonic energies had been loosed now, and God alone could foresee the outcome. What was possible? Was it possible that what the devil had promised William Baker and of Andover would come to pass under God's providence, that there would be no more sin or shame or judgment, that all men should be equal and live bravely? Well, it was God's will. God had delivered them, if not to the devil, at least to an adversary. God saved the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The symptoms of diabolism had faded at last in Salem village. So odd a sight for God to choose as the battleground between hell and heaven. There were deviltry aplenty in Boston. Even while the judges were dismissing the witches, Cotton Mather's own wife, she who had once had had to smother a laugh at the sight of diabolic manifestation was observed in the prison in the person of little Martha Goodwin had been affrighted on her porch by a diabolic vision and had in consequence given birth to a malformed short-lived child. And as if that were not enough, Mather himself, because of his charitable interest in certain afflicted maids of Boston, was about to be given to drink of a vinegar of mockery by what he called the the witlings of the coffee houses. The devil had lately discovered to Boston a new brew which sharpened the wit and incited it to skepticism. Here in the waning days of the witchcraft, uh, were were wont to sit several of the devil's own who made it their business to keep a derisive eye on the current activities of Cotton Mather and to publish them to the town. Until later, there had been little occasion to connect the younger Mather with the witchcraft. He he who had been so active in the Glover affair and whose record of the case had helped prepare Massachusetts for the new outbreak had nevertheless remained surprisingly aloof from the latter. Not that the aloofness had been by initiation, it was simply a matter of living far from Salem and having much to detain him in Boston. Early in the day, he had written to the Salem authorities offering to receive any 6 girls into his home for observation and treatment. It had the magistrates responded, it is probable that they would have exchanged a major calamity for yet another quaint uh, uh, archy monograph. The segregation of the girls would have served to localize the psychic infection, and the girls themselves exposed to the wayward streak of poetry and Mather's composition would almost certainly uh, have found their fantasies deflected to the more normal preoccupations of adolescence. They would, in short, like a large portion of the female members of his congregation at any given time, have fallen in love with him. Infatuation is not any guarantee against hysteria, quite the contrary. But in this case, such development might have diverted the antics of the girls, so less malignant forms. Young Anne Putnam might, like Martha Goodwin, have ridden an airy horse up and down the stairs and into the pastor's study to find herself uh, to find her catharsis rather than before the gallows. If it had not been given Mathers thus to experiment, he had watched the case from afar and had only thrice taken positive action. One of these occasions had been his drafting of the advice of the ministers to the judges, cautioning them against too great reliance on spectral evidence, though praising their zeal even before the matter of unofficial ha, even before then Mather had unofficially written in the same vein to Judge John Richards, not only warning him against spectral evidence but against uncritical acceptance of such confessions as might come from the delirious brain or the disconnected heart. He specifically denounced torture as a means of getting confessions. His only dramatic intervention in the witchcraft had been the speech he had made to the crowd by the hanging of Burroughs. He the speech was the only real complaint that his enemies could make against him. There were some who thought that Mather had still a small charity to a fellow minister in his hour of need, yet not much could be fairly made of the incident. Had not Mather spoken, another must, for the crowd before the gallows was fast deteriorating into a mob. Mather had been Mather, who had seen mobs in Boston in 1689, had acted instinctively and without premeditation to do what was necessary to quiet this one. Control of the crowd and not slander of Burroughs had been his purpose. In any case, the incident was now well in the past. It would not have been held a serious court against Mather, nor could his name have been fairly connected with the witchcraft, but for what happened after it was all over. On 22 September 1692, a kind of council of war had been called at Samuel Sewall's house in Boston. Present were Samuel's brother Stephen of Salem, Captain John Higginson, John Harthron, William Salton, and Cotton Mather. The subject under discussion was the property of making public some of the evidence in the witch trials. Not since Lawson brief and true narrative of last spring had there been any authoritative published statement, and the latter had been written months in advance of the setting of the court of Oyer and Terminer. Now, with so much irresponsible talk going on, it seemed clear that the time had come for an official report on what the judges had accomplished for Massachusetts. It would be an interim report. At this date, the judges expected to go forward with the trials in October. In spite of the rising tide of protest, none could know that the 7 women and 1 man who that day hung on the gallows in Salem would be the very last witches to hang in Massachusetts. Thank goodness for that. Mather stood ready to take on this assignment and had been anticipating it for some time. To this end, he had been accumulating some of his own sermons, notably his hortatory and necessarily address, with his charge upon the conscience of New England. 'Tis our worldliness, our formality, our sensuality, and our iniquity that has helped this letting of the devils in. In addition, he had been after Stephen Sewall to copy out such of the documents in Salem as could be in the history of the witchcraft. Some of this material, not quite so much as he had hoped, was now available, for it was the will of his colleagues that he would gladly do his best with the subject which had been, he modestly reminded them, sometimes counted not unworthy the pen even of a king. Whatever the faults of the younger Mather, procrastination was not one of them. By early October, when Phipps returned to the manuscript was not only complete, awaiting the latter's approval, but had already had some circulation among the uh, dignitaries of the colony that he had done so that he had also done his work well and achieved what could be regarded as a authoritative version of the affair was in, indicated not only by a laudatory preface by Stulton, but by the fact that Sir William borrowed whole paragraphs of incorporation into his first report to England. Phipes did not, however, encourage publication. Brattle's letter, which denounced the entire premise of the trials, was circulating as far and as fast as Mather's defense. At the time, such diversity of opinion so hotly expressed, the governor found it wise to suppress any publicity whatsoever. It was not until 1693, when the trials had been resumed on the new basis of the general jail delivery begun, that he judged it wise to let Mather publish his Wonders of the Invisible World. Mather's narrative was the nearest equivalent Massachusetts was to get to a full newspaper report of the mysterious events in court. The public fell on it with avidity and got their money's worth. Mingled in some sermons and philosophizings, Mather had presented a full and accurate account of the examinations and trials of 5 representative witches: George Burroughs, Bridget Bishop, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, and Martha Carrier. He had followed the records of painstaking detail, summarizing completely when he did not quote in full. Not even his worst enemies were ever to find fault with his court reporting, and compared with the chapbooks of such cases put out to entertain the English public, it was a journalistic masterpiece. Yet this document, so well planned and executed, so invaluable to the historian, was to serve the reputation of Mather ill. It had 2 conspicuous defects: its omissions and its tone. Those who really knew the trials read the significance into the fact that Mather had carefully avoided several of their most embarrassing aspects: Rebecca's nurse brief acquittal, the powerful reasoning of John Proctor and Mary Etsy's. The avoidance, to be sure, was by no means necessarily Mather's doing. What to include and what to omit had certainly been one of the subjects of discussion at the editorial meeting at Sewall's house. These circumstances could not, however, negate the fact that Mather had lent his hand to fabricating that most dangerous of falsehoods, the half-truth. The tone of the book was another thing again, and wholly Mather's. It suggested that the Dutch divines had spoken against spectral evidence in vain, and that Mather himself, in recommending caution in this direction, had not meant it. For he had written throughout in a spirit of childlike marveling credulity. Yet how could Mather, given his temperament, have written otherwise of his witches? As well as Shakespeare to revise Macbeth without mentioning the weird sisters of Milton, to erase all reference to Satan and Paradise Lost, as to ask Mather to do other than he had done. There was in him such of the artist of artistry in his uh, uh, austere position in theocratic Massachusetts, found only such wayward expressions as this. To such a temperament, and some of the afflicted girls probably resembled him in this, the details of the witchcraft, of horns that sounded across Essex County at midnight, the airborne excursions of Paris pasture, and folklore uh, of uh, gaudily embroidered the life of Susan Martin, uh, were less a horror and an abomination than a part of the suppressed color and drama of life. Mather's righteous indignation and such things could be uh, that such things could be was unnecessarily submerged in the thrill of having been present as spectator at the collision between heaven and hell. The witchcraft was one experience that Mather would not willingly have forgone. It was the scarlet thread drawn through the drab of New England homespur, but men who had been painfully involved in the crisis were little likely to respond to so artless and unconsciously poetic a viewpoint. That impressed them was that in his zeal for discovering witches, an eminent Boston divine had uh, had solidified his capacity to see human beings in their very real agonies, that in sort to judge by the tone of his record he had learned nothing at all from experience. So far as he was concerned, the delirium might begin again full force tomorrow. Indeed, delusions had by no means spent itself. While the afflicted of Andover and Salem were falling one by one into silence, dampened by the lack of responsive audience, uh, Mather, responsive audience, new voices were being heard in Boston. To two of these matters was giving all the attention he could spare from his parochial duties. He was, in fact, launched on the whole new cycle of psychic research. The first case to come to his attention was that of Mercy Short, 17-year-old servant maid of Boston, recently back from captivity among the Indians, who, as natural creatures of the devil, had probably had not too wholesome influences on the girl, so they were racist. What a surprise. It was Mercy who, in the course of the Call Boston prison in the summer of 1692, had mocked Sarah Good's plea for tobacco and had been afflicted since. One would have supposed that the hanging of Sarah would have released Mercy, but not at all. Sarah must have delegated the torture of the girls to her surviving confederates, who for it went right on through the summer and fall and became a favorite subject of speculation among the frequenters of the coffee house. On 4 December, Mercy achieved the attention of Cotton Mather by falling into such convulsions during a sermon that she had to be carried out. Normally, Mather looked her up afterwards, but he had a little company of prying neighbors. A little company of praying neighbors. He had long been itching to study the close range, the type of case responsible for the Salem outbreak. Now, at last, he had one of his own precinct. From his interviews with the medium, he got a first hand description of the devil, a short and black man with a wrench, no taller than an ordinary walking staff. He was not a Negro, but of a 20 or 20, no, uh, Tawny, Tawny or an Indian color. He wore a high crowned hat with straight hair, and he had a cloven foot. The eyes of this creature flamed unbearably, resembling, according to Mercy, a glass ball of a lantern. Mather took with him uh, through the dim streets of Boston to his nautical rambles. On his not nautical rambles, sometimes Mercy's affliction took the form of long fasts during which she could force herself to take nothing but hard cider. Sometimes she was seared by flames, and her visitors could smell the brimstone and see the burns of Mercy's flesh, though, as 'tis the strange property of many uh, with witch marks, these were cured in perhaps less than a minute. Sometimes the devil faced quite li- Sometimes the devil forced white liquid down her throat. Sometimes she had fits of wild frolic when she was deaf to all prayers. It was not for want of name calling on Mercy's part that these investigations did not result in arrest. She cried out against all sorts of people, especially some with whom she had recently quarreled. Uh, but Mather, acting with the discretion for which he was not to be thanked, decided that most of these were devil's delusions, and charged his praying company not to report them. Among Mercy's more oblique accusations was Mather himself, the fact that he gave more gratification than otherwise, for he gathered from the context that the devil feared and hated him more than any other minister in New England. A very pretty compliment. Mercy responding to fasting prayers and the invisible ministrations of an angel who sometimes fended the devils off, finally came out of her trance in March 1693. And Mather wrote up on his observations under the title of A Brand Plucked Out of the Burning. Somehow he did not publish it. The jail delivery was in progress, and friends and relatives of released witches would not appreciate yet another starry eyed report of this sort, especially so soon after the wonders of from whose philosophies some of them were cringing. Or perhaps it was the development of Mercy herself which restrained him. The sad truth was that when the devil was cast out of her, 7 others took its place, these being devils of a more common and carnal sort. Mathers had impressive in Martyrs are impressive in the long run only when they are also saints. Since Mercy was plainly nothing of the sort, Mather's pious account of her suffering would be oddly received in Boston's coffee houses, places much more productive of skepticism than the ale house had ever been. Mather did not risk it. Mather was, however, by means done with the devil. In September 1693, he made a trip to Salem to get furniture for the completion of the work now nearest to his heart, his Mongolia Christi Americana. It was to be his epic in somewhat the same way the Paradise Lost was Milton's. His purpose was cognate, though, whereas Milton had undertaken to justify the ways of God to man, Mather would seek to justify the ways of man to God. Particularly, man was represented by the leaders of Puritan theocracy. He would eschew the uh, sonorities of black verse for the plainer sense of English prose, albeit richly embellished by Latinism and the somber glory of such characters as Beelzebub and Lucifer. For the more unassuming personnel to be found in New England, personages of uh, Mag- Magdalena was indeed a. Oh, wait, was that. Sorry, I need to go back. So the thing that he was working on, I misread it by mistake. It was Magdalena Christi Americana. So that's what he was working on. Uh, the Magdalena was indeed the preliminary history of churches in New England. Lucifer, however, would not be ignored in Mather's work. He would again give himself the luxury of describing the fiend's descent on Salem village. To such an end he came to Salem. He delivered 2 sermons, and between them uh, pursued his inquiries. He was much interested in the Miss Carter and his own viewpoint on late events. This lady was in direct communication with shitting spirits, who told her that a new storm of witchcraft would fall on the country and chastise the iniquity that was used in the willful smothering and covering of the last. This news Mather received about was a general might receive intelligence that he would soon be called upon to march again. There had indeed been something abrupt, something questionable about the end of the witchcraft. The case had not been so much disposed of as allowed to collapse. It was as if an army of occupation had been called home without awaiting the signing of a peace treaty. It would be little wonder if the devil were to begin a new assault against a people so little capable of disdain effort. This is what I don't understand about these people, because there's still people these days that think like this. At what point does killing or searching for a reason to kill someone else make you a better person? I will never understand. Because it does really seem like in this passage I just read that he is looking for any reason whatsoever to step back into gear to persecute more witches on crazy ass beliefs. These reflections were reinforced by evidence that the devil was interfering directly in his own affairs. He had empowered 2 sermons. He had prepared 2 sermons to deliver in Salem, and the devil stole both. Luckily, he was able to give them from memory, so the devil got nothing. The story did not end there. When he got home to Boston, he found that affliction had started again in his own home, neighborhood, in the person of another 17-year-old, one Margaret Rule. What's up with all these 17-year-olds? From Margaret's lips, he learned what had happened in Salem. The 8 spectral shapes that tormented her had stole his sermons and were bragging about it. Yet it was not given to creatures covenant to the devil to keep a hold on a thing so holy as a sermon by Cotton Mather. In October, the spirits relaxed their grip and dropped the missing manuscripts leaves by leaf about the streets of Len. Every page was recovered in a perfect state of preservation. After such Proton's Mather could not deny his time and prayers to a new victim of the invisible world. Margaret was indeed a pitiful case. Her present physical tortures had been preceded by a spiritual phase in which she was prey to the belief that she was damned. Now she was the victim of witches who desired her to sign the book. She was resisting heroically, and before a cloud of witnesses. For Margaret was yet another who had to be carried shrieking from meeting since it had first happened on 10 September. She had become the major theatrical attention in Boston. If Mather wanted to minister to her privately, he must first clear the room for a company, by no means a praying company, of 30 or 40 spectators. Frequently, he did not take this precaution, and with the result that a fraction of the population of Boston was entertained not only by the antics of Margaret, but by the measures taken by Mather to exorcise her demons. Margaret's afflictions had begun with the involuntary fast. For 9 days her teeth had set against food, though occasionally it was possible to get her mouth open just wide enough to emit a sip of rum. That's the devil all over, commented a seaman. Sometimes it was the devil who forced open her mouth in order to pour scalding brimstone down her throat, so that people in the room could hardly bear the smell of the stuff or the sound of the girl's screams. Marvels happened right under the eyes of the beholders. Some of them saw the woman stuck full of pins. Sick men signed affidavits that they had seen her pulled to the ceiling by invisible hands, and that it took their concerted might to pull her back to bed again. Mather himself once made a grab for something staring on her pillow, and felt an imp in his hand, tangible and yet invisible, and so startling in that combination that he let it give way. She dreamed dreams and saw visions. She forecast the drawing of a young man, and exactly as she spoke, it happened. Almost this is by God's providence. The man wasn't actually downed, but was fished out of the water into which sundry devils had impelled him to leap. She saw the thieving of old man's will. She saw the faces of her tormentors on another or any way of some of them, particularly that of an evil old woman who had been taken in the recent witchcraft and incontently released again when the judges lost their heart for proper prosecution. Some witches, she said, could not identify because they, having learned a thing or two, now went about their business veiled. Veiled or no, when Mather got to her, he prevailed on her to forbear blazing their names, lest any good person come to suffer any blast of of reputation. He was willing that he was willing that she named them he was willing that she named them to him privately and was reassured, for they were the sort of wretches who, for these many years, have given over a violent presumption of witchcraft, as perhaps any creature yet living on this earth. Even so, he did not report them. He got a small thanks for his self-sacrificing labors on behalf of Margaret Roll. His efforts had been observed by the motley company come off the streets of Boston and see the show. Merchants, seamen, scholars, good wives, everybody. These behaved decorously enough in his presence, and on the whole, he thought it well that a variety of observers witnessed the agonies of the girl, the better to combat the skepticism of the coffee houses. What he did not know was that one of these coffee house witlings had not only got in with the rest, but was taking copious notes of the seances and preparing to publish. The observer was Robert Claff, an obscure merchant of Boston. He was a friend of Thomas Brattle and agreed with the spectral viewpoint expressed in Brattle's letter, and had therefore come to watch Mather in none too relevant a frame of mind. What his cold eye noted on the afflicted Margaret was her craving for the attentions of men. She visibly liked being stroked across the face and naked breast and belly of by the Mathers, father and son, this being a kind of laying on the hand by which they tried to relieve her. But let a woman touch her, and she cried out sharply, "Don't you meddle with me." When the ministers withdrew, Margaret told the woman to clear altogether, saying that the company of men was not offensive to her, and having hold of the hand of a young man said to have been her sweetheart, she pulled him again into his seat, saying he should not go tonight. 6 days later, Claff found her enjoying what Mather had explained to observers as her laughing time. She must now laugh. Mather having already gone for evening, she was free to make eyes with yet another young man to fuss with her attendants because they did not put her on a clean cap, but let her lie so like breasts, saying she would lose her fellows. There was talk, to be sure, about her frightful affliction earlier in the day, and there were symptoms of reoccurrence when one or two of the women got a whiff of brimstone. Everyone sniffed with them, but uh, had the others, but Clef and the others couldn't pick up the scent and said so. The women became less sure of themselves. They could smell something, they said. They were not that sure. They were not sure that. They were not sure what. Clef, in short, was less than impressed with the martyr Margaret. Even less had he been impressed in the still recent past by what he called a bigoted zeal stirring up a blind and most bloody rage against innocent people by such media as these. He resented the credulous interest of the Mathers, um, uh, particularly Cotton. This sort of thing had led to a public disaster only 2 years earlier. Clef did not propose to stand by and watched the engineering of a second outbreak. Accordingly, he copied out his notes and let them circulate from hand to hand. Nevertheless, in his life had Mather been so rudely handled or affronted as he was by the talk to which these notes given rise. He was enraged by the description of his stroking the half naked Margaret, so as to make people believe a smutty thing of me. His first impulse was to bring suit for scoundrel's libel. His second, not to risk so public an a appearance on so delicate an issue. The warrant was issued against Clef, um, but when the latter appeared before court, none came against him, and the case was dismissed. The larger case was not at all dismissed, however. The controversy between minister and merchant went on for years and culminated at the turn of the century in the book called More Wonders of the Invisible World, a work by Clef with the involuntary collaboration of Mather and a probable but this disguised contribution by Brattle. Its core was latter its core was the later witch writings of Mather, including his unpublished account of Margaret Roll. To this, Cliff added his own appendix to Mather's Wonders, finishing full details on cases which Mather had neglected, notably that of Rebecca Nurse, and adding reports by such survivors as Carey's and John Alden. Its publication was one of the most afflicting things that ever happened to Mather, his sorrow's crown of sorrow. And indeed, though Clef's work was the valuable addition to the history of witchcraft, it did inflict an injustice on Mather in connecting his name insparingly with a tragedy with which he actually had little to do. Increased Mather, who himself had drawn Clef's fire owing to his proposal to New England ministers in 1695 that they continued to count remarkables, among them evidence of the agency of the invisible world, stood loyally by his son and made a spectacle for the of the infamy of the book, or so the story goes, by having it burned in the Harvard Yard. This fine symbolic gesture had oddly little effect in preventing its circulation. Margaret Wool had in the meantime come out of her fits long since. It was well that Clef never heard of her last seance with Mather. For doing it, she dreamily named it the wizard whose shape was currently afflicting her, and it was none other than Cotton's. Mather was terrified. Superstition played little part in his fright, nor did he anticipate taking a place by Burroughs on the gallows. What unmanned him was the derision of the coffee house. If this accusation ever got around, a heroic measure were necessary. Heights of prayer to which he had never won before, he won them now. Finally, after Mather had spent several hours in the dust before his God, the shitting spirit that had intermittently appeared to Margaret came again and informed her that Mather was now her father in Christ, and that through God's providence he had saved her. The angel also opened her eyes to the actual demons crowded around her. They were rather pitiful. The devil himself stood over them, lashing them to further effect. For all the world, like the overseer whipping his slaves, indeed the demons were fainting under the punishment and under the strain of their hopeless endeavor. At last they cried out to Margaret, "Go, and the devil go with you. We can do no more." Then they fled the place, nor did they come again, at least in that guise. Margaret's affliction and Boston's best show were both a thing of the past. Hereafter Margaret had no difficulty in getting privacy for her interviews with her fellows. Mather, for his part, learned to keep strictly away from her. His spiritual daughter did not turn out to be a very nice girl.